was a kid, I was kind of obsessed with slavery. It all goes back to 1977. I was in third grade, and I saw the television miniseries Roots for the first time. Roots was based on the book by Alex Haley, and it was an examination of American slavery through multiple generations of a single family. It captured my imagination, it piqued my curiosity, and it got me thinking about genealogy. It made me want to know more about myself. I was only 8 years old at the time, but I was determined to know more about who I was through where I came from. Now, my paternal grandparents both came from Southern Virginia. They met in high school, and to hear my grandmother tell the story, my grandfather fell in love with her at first sight. They courted, they dated, they got married, they had a family. And that was pretty much all I ever got out of anybody about family history. I wanted to know more, but people really weren't willing to talk. My grandmother sat down with me at one point when I was very young, and she told me that her grandfather was a slave. And then she told me that some things were just too painful to talk about. I didn't really understand what she meant at the time, so I didn't push the topic. And nobody ever really talked about family history or the past, and all the things that I wanted to know when I was a kid, I never had the chance to learn. Fast forward 18 years later, my grandmother had died, and most of her generation was gone as well. There were only a few elders left in the family, and I knew that if I didn't start talking to people about the things that were too painful to talk about, history would be lost. So I sat down with the elders that were still alive, and I began to ask questions. I began to do research. I even took a trip back down to rural Virginia where my grandparents grew up. I visited the graves of my past ancestors, and little by little, I began to piece together the history of my family. And little by little, I began to understand what my grandmother meant when she said some things were too painful to talk about. My grandmother's grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, Nelson Hancock, was born a slave in 1855. This was approximately 6 years before the American Civil War, and approximately 8 years before Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing all slaves. Nelson's mother was also a slave. Her name was Lelia Moore. Now, Lelia Moore was sold to another plantation before Nelson was 5. And according to family history, Nelson never saw his mother again. There's not much known about Lelia Moore other than what was passed down through word of mouth. Everything that I know about her, I learned from people who had learned from other people. There's only one piece of documentation of her existence, and that is the 1850 slave schedule. Slave schedules were essentially property manifests that were filled out in conjunction with the US Census. And everything that is actually known, factually known about Lelia Moore is from the 1850 slave schedule. When we look at this, which is essentially my family history right here, you can see it in a nice line. There's nothing about Lelia Moore. We're not even exactly sure when she was born, and we know nothing about her other than the fact that on the 1850 slave schedule, she was listed as the property of John Douglas Hancock. Now, John Douglas Hancock was also the father of Nelson Hancock, making him my great-great-great-grandfather. Now, to be clear, John Douglas Hancock and Lelia Moore were not married. They were not lovers. And everything that we know about slavery in America makes it safe to hypothesize that their relationship was non-consensual. Now, if we take a look at this family tree, we start to see something very interesting. Because again, Lelia Moore, we know nothing about her. But with John Douglas Hancock, we can trace his family back, another 300-400 years? He was descendant from the first settlers to come to the colonies, to the Virginia colonies. But there's nothing about Lelia Moore. It's as if her existence didn't matter. And it's not just some anomaly. It's not just one little branch of the family tree, because if we go over and look at my grandfather's side of the family tree, we see something very similar. We see myself, we see my father, we see my grandfather and my great-grandfather, and we're able to trace the history of my family back just a little bit farther to my fifth great-grandmother. This is Mary Henry. Now, there's nothing known about Mary Henry other than the fact that she was born sometime around 1783 and that she was the mother of Moses Ramey. Now, what we know about Moses Ramey, aside from who his mother was, is who his father was. His father was a man named John Ramey, and John Ramey was, guess what? His owner. We look at this family history, this whole separate branch of my family tree, and we see the same thing. Mary Henry, nothing about her beyond her name. We don't know the name of her parents. We don't know her ultimate fate. We just know that she had a son with someone named John Ramey. Now, John Ramey, by comparison, we can trace his family all the way back to 13th century France. He was descendant of French royalty. I can actually trace him back further than 1200, except there wasn't really enough room to fit it on the slide. I stand here before you, the descendant of slaves, but also the descendant of slave owners. And let me tell you, that is a reality that is almost impossible to wrap my brain around. I am the descendant of those that were oppressed and the oppressors. And the more I dig deep into my family history, the more I paint a portrait of myself that is both troubling and unbalanced. Because on one side, I've got slave owners that I can trace back to 13th century France, to royalty. And on the other hand, I have slaves. There's almost nothing known about them. As I sat and began to study the history of slavery in America, I realized that what I was studying was the prolonged history of the dehumanization of Africans and their descendants. You see, slaves were not considered people. Slaves were property. They were bought, sold, and traded. That is the reality of slavery. But it's not the truth of the slave. The slave was never a slave. Slaves were human beings who were enslaved. They were people who were placed in a state and condition, and a word was used to describe them that separated them from their humanity. It made them less than what they were. And this was the justification that allowed for centuries of dehumanization of Africans and their descendants. And when you are the descendant of enslaved Africans, you are the descendant of people who have been denied their humanity. It's as if their existence never mattered. No one took the time to remember them. No one took the time to record their names or their dates or their birth dates. It's as if millions of chapters of American history have never been written and never been told. But on a personal level, I'm talking about my family. I'm talking about my fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth great-grandparents. I'm talking about distant aunts and uncles and cousins, all of whom have been forgotten, never told their stories. They're missing, which means part of me is missing, which means that I'm incomplete. Now, my grandmother used to say that some things were too painful to talk about. And she was right. Some things are too painful to talk about. But that doesn't mean that I won't talk about them. I talk about the things that are too painful to talk about because there were millions of people, my ancestors included, who were denied their humanity, and they need their humanity restored. I talk about the things that are painful because today, in the 21st century, we're still dealing with people being dehumanized. We're still dealing with people who are being treated less than what they are simply because of the color of their skin or their gender or their religion or who they choose to love. I talk about these things because I need to stake a claim to my humanity, because there are people out there who still believe that I am inferior. And I talk about the things that are too painful to talk about because ultimately, this is what we all need to do. We need to talk about the things that are too painful because it is the only way we can ever come closer to finding peace between the oppressor and the oppressed. Thank you.